Good evening. Thank you very much for joining and welcome to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much again for joining. It's my distinct pleasure to be one more time with all of you. Now, I am going to encourage all of you and those of you who have not yet subscribed to my channel to subscribe and to like it and to share so that our channel can grow. We want to spread information and to disseminate good information as best as is possible. We're living in times where we are inundated with loads of different information. And a lot of times they do not contain the substance that we would like to have and the critical conversations that I think most of you on this channel would like to be engaged in. So remember now that you need to subscribe and to like and to share and to comment on the channel to show that you are actually supporting the channel. Some of you also do not have the courage to speak and to speak on a public platform. Some of you might have the ability to speak, but you are afraid. You think that perhaps you're going to lose your jobs and that other castigatory, forms of punishment might be inflicted on you, right? So you prefer not to do so. So you ought to support those who have the audacity, right? And they have the moral courage to stand up amidst adversity. Now, I was reading the New York Times. Well, this article caught my attention. Let me share my screen with you. I think I have to get that on the screen. All right, so let me get that. So we have here the New York Times is presenting an article, and it says here, the New York Times, Israel-Hamas war. Israel says no hostage release or pause in fighting before Friday. Right, so that's interesting that people want to see their loved ones because there are American hostages, among others, and Israel is insisting that there will be no release of the hostages until Friday. Well, let's see what the New York Times piece is saying here. The temporary ceasefire paired with the release of hostages held in Gaza and Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails will likely not begin until Friday at the earliest, Israeli officials said on Wednesday night, as negotiators continued to hammer out details of an agreement between Israel and Hamas that would see a pause in fighting to allow for groups of hostages and Palestinian prisoners to be released. Right, so we have to wait on them. Israel decides that, right, because Israel has that level of authority. The new timing for the releases came in a statement issued by the National Security Council through the Israeli Prime Minister's office and appeared to rule out the possibility that hostages could be freed on Thursday, as many of their families had hoped. Right, so here the family members were hoping that their loved ones would have been released by Friday, but Israel is intervening and says that that is not possible. The timing on the ceasefire was disclosed by an Israeli official speaking on condition of anonymity about the highly sensitive issue. The new information underscored the fluidity of the negotiations between Israel and Hamas, which are being mediated by Qatar or Qatar. The two sides have not announced specific plans for an exchange of at least 150 Palestinian women and children jailed by Israel for at least 50 Israeli women and children held in Gaza, including exactly when people would begin being released and who would be included. The Israeli military also said it continued to fight in the Gaza Strip, highlighting that the agreement to pause the fighting was not yet in place. Now, this is strange. The Israeli military also said that it continued to fight in the Gaza Strip, highlighting that the agreement to pause the fighting was not yet in place. So there's no agreement. So why are they telling us that there might be possible agreement if there is no yet agreement? And probably bring up the hopes of the family members that their families would have been released by Friday, but there is not yet an agreement. And as far as we know, the war continues and lives continue to be lost. Right? And this is a very, very sad situation that these two countries, the United States and Israel, and of course the Hamas people, we don't know about the Palestinians. One of the things that is very important that we understand is that we cannot take any sides here, right? We can't say the US is wrong. Well, we know that they're wrong in terms of killing. They're leading out in the war with Israel. So that is wrong, and we ought to let our voices be heard, right? That killing of people unnecessarily is wrong. But the facts surrounding what happened, when, where, why, we do not have all of that information. And one of the things you must understand is that you cannot trust the media for anything, whether it's the right-wing media houses or the left-wing media houses. So you have to read and try to compile all the facts that you can. Facts are not necessarily truth, right? And that's why we have to amass all the facts, examine all the facts, right, on all sides, and to see whether or not we can make sense of what is happening and come to an understanding of the truth, right? But people often say, oh yeah, these are the facts. Facts are not truth. Facts are just evidence, and evidence according to people. So you have factual lies. There are lots of factual lies out there in the media that we call misinformation and disinformation. And I've said many times, perhaps not on this channel, but to a lot of the people with whom I speak, that the mainstream media outlets, that is, are the greatest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation, right? And I think the New York Times should be asking harder questions as to why the people's family members, the hostages, cannot be released. Why is there not an agreement yet? What is causing that holdup for the agreement to be made? Israeli officials have confirmed that the Israeli Air Force will not fly over southern Gaza during the temporary ceasefire and will have a 6-hour daily window in which there will be no fights in the northern end of the territory. So they control that. Means therefore that they decide when wars should be waged and when we should have a pause in the war. You know, all of that depends on the agreement. Is this a form of mind control? Right? While people's lives are in stake, in danger. I should say people's lives are at stake, I should say, sorry. Right? While people's lives are in danger and are at stake, we continue to play politics. Right? Because this is politics at its best. Hamas and its allies in Gaza captured about 240 hostages during their raid on southern Israel on October 7th, during which they killed an estimated 1,200 people. That's a lot of people to die, according to Israeli officials. Israel has responded with thousands of airstrikes and by invading Gaza with ground forces, killing more than 12,000 people in the fighting, according to health officials in the Hamas-controlled territory. If the multi-day pause holds, it would be the longest halt in hostilities since the start of the 47-day war. But with no third party on the ground to secure the deal, it could easily break down like many other ceasefire deals in the long history of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Hamas said in a statement on Wednesday that while it had agreed to a truce, our hands will remain on the trigger. Will it? And Israeli officials have said that their war in Gaza will continue once the pause ends. So this is where it's leading, where both sides are playing politics with people's lives, the Palestinians and also the hostages, whose lives are also in danger. Because if there is no appropriate agreement on both sides, it means therefore that the hostages, their lives can be sacrificed. And American citizens have got to be very, very concerned about this. Of course, all the citizens of the world, but particularly Israeli and American citizens, because when you have these things happening and people are listening to one side of the story, right? So the Muslims are hearing one side of the story, the Arabs are hearing one side of the stories, the Jews are listening to one side of the story, the Americans are listening to one side of the story, the Palestinians, for the most part, might be listening to one side of the story. Anger begins to flare. And when anger begins to flare, people generally behave irrationally. And that might lead to the attack of innocent lives. So Americans, whether you're on the continent, you're on the soil, in the United States itself, you're at home, or whether you are abroad, you must take this very seriously. Because when people's anger gets a hold of them, oftentimes they do things that they perhaps would not have done under normal circumstances. So war is not something that is good. It always brings blowback. And according to Chalmers Johnson, he said that blowback really is a nation reaps what it sows. So whether you want to call it karma or you want to call it God's judgment, you must be prepared for the consequences of war. And there is this very, what should I say, superficial conversation that is happening in the US and among US citizens and people of the world in general. Oh, the US does not care about brown people. They care more about white people. In the first place, I've told you that there's no white people. There are no white people. White is a political construct. All right? Have you ever seen a white person, white in color? That is not normal. That's not a normal person, right? We are all different shades of brown, and that's scientific, basic scientific knowledge. And we've got to reorient ourselves to understand what race and ethnicity and that. There's only one human race. We have different ethnic groups, national groups, different linguistic groups. And I think even the great African-American leader, civil rights leader, Malcolm X, understood that. Because when he went to Saudi Arabia, when he went to the Middle East, and he thought that he was going to see, all Arabs or Muslims were perhaps people of color, brown people, he realized that there are people there with whom he thought, with the political understanding that it was white and with blue eyes and so forth, so it's not what he had thought, right? Because color has nothing to do with your national or your ethnic group, right? We must understand that. And, one of the things that is amazing as you read history, for example, the Civil War in the United States, the Southerners, when they started the war, and the Northerners too, but, let's look at the Southerners now. They didn't want, of course, the slaves to participate in the Civil War. So they enlisted all the white men that they could, conscript into their military, right? To fight for the Confederacy, right? Now, 2 years into the war, when these so-called white soldiers realized that they were dying at an alarming rate, their eyes were opened. And do you know what they said? They said, why are we fighting in defense of these elites, these so-called white elites? They are not concerned about us. They are only concerned about defending their own interests. And they stopped. Many of them came out of the army and said that they would not fight because they realized that it was not for their freedom that they were fighting for. Right? They were fighting for the interests of the American elites, the American financial elites. They understood that. And these were not brilliant people. They were not brilliant minds. Right? But they observed what was happening on the ground, and they were able to understand that we're not here fighting to defend the interests of ordinary American citizens. This is a war, the Civil War, which it was a war in terms of who would control the levers of economic power, whether the South, the southern parts of the United States, or the northern parts of the United States would control the levers of economic power. Right? But of course, the slaves were involved. They were at the center. Why? Because, of course, without them, America would not have been able to have amassed the wealth that she amassed during that time. Right? And that's why it was part of slavery. Now, it was after the fact that these white, so-called white soldiers didn't want to die for the Confederacy, because a lot of them had died, and those who had witnessed it realized that they were sacrificing their lives for these people, and they stopped. And that was when the Southerners, right, decided that the Southerners, the plantocracy, decided that they would conscript Black Americans to fight. Right? So I just want to say here that this is not about a brown and white war, right? This is an attack on humanity. Whether you're brown, or if you consider yourself to be Black, or, as I'm saying, you consider yourself to be white, which is a political construct. Right? These colorisms have been made to divide the human race, so that these elites can wage their wars, they can divide us, and that is how they conquer us. Right? So I don't want to hear you talk about, white versus brown, because I'm sure there are people who you think are, who look European, who are also Palestinians, and vice versa. There are Jews who look Palestinians, have the same phenotype, right? So we've got to stop talking about this white and brown and Black and all this nonsense. And oftentimes Americans see other people and they make assumptions of people based on their color, the color of their skins, right? Because culture and language is what predominates. That's what these are the most important tools to recognize who a person is: his culture and language. I've often said, and I will say it again, that a Black American who was born on that soil, right, has a greater or a closer link to the so-called European American than a person coming from Russia, even though that person you think is white, or the person coming from Britain, even Britain, right? Let's say Britain, because Britain, the British are cousins of the United States, right? So even what you call a white Brit, the Black American has, should have, and does have culturally a closer relationship with the European American, what you call a white American. Because it is the culture and the language which define a person. And in some cases, we also have religion. But these two are the most important. So stop talking about looking at people and saying and dividing people by color, because you cannot define somebody by their color. You can't define their status. You can't define their education, their sophistication, right? If we understand these basic principles, I think that we perhaps would not be waging a lot of wars. Also, language and culture are very, very important, play a pivotal role in the identity of human beings, not their color. Because essentially, as I've said, we're all the same color anyway. Some are lighter and some are darker shades of brown. There are no white people, as we have been misinformed, we have been miseducated. I think we need to talk about the miseducation of the human race. We talk about the miseducation, Carter G. Woodson, of the American Negro, right? But we have to talk about the miseducation of the human race. That is very important. Okay, now somebody sent me this video, which I watched, and it says 100 plus Biden's own staffers accused him of misinformation on Israel-Palestine, and this is coming from the Rising, program that's on YouTube. Now, when I saw the title, of course, my reaction to it was, yeah, because we are living in a society, or Washington really is a state of, well, it's a state, but it's a district of misinformation, right? Nothing new. Because if you're living in an empire, how do you think the empire has to survive? Through disinformation and misinformation. Because its major quest is to kill, is to wage war. So it has to lie to you. And one of the reasons why the empire is lying to you right now is because it has not yet been fully its empire has not been fully achieved yet. Let me put it in those words. Right? The United States still behaves as if it's a democracy, right? Even though it's an empire. So we have said before that the Constitution, the American Constitution, does it checks the power in Washington, right? But there are forces behind the scenes who are working laboriously to destroy the entire Constitution. And when that Constitution is destroyed, then the empire will be left naked. Right? But slowly but surely, we're seeing where the empire is imploding and its agenda is being unveiled before our eyes. And we've got to take stock. Right? We can't afford now to be siding with right-wingers or with left-wingers. We must begin to side with the truth, right? And Christ says that he is the truth, right? Right? And we're not suggesting here that you are just going to be, a fanatic and just read your Bibles and you're going to alienate yourself from the world, because the Bible says that we should live in the world, but we should not be a part of the world. So there are people, there are humans that God has set up, institutions that he has set up. But we must study these institutions, and we must be aware of whether or not they're presenting the truth that God wants to disseminate, or they are lying, right? And lying is not a characteristic of God, right? Anything that is lying is not of God and is of the evil one. And we're finding daily where the media houses, the mainstream Western corporate-run media houses and outlets, are just disseminating lies upon lies, lies upon lies. And sometimes there are some half-truths. And these half-truths are very, very dangerous, because you have some element of truth, but the small, sometimes the minute element of lies and deceptions can seduce you into making bad decisions. Now, I saw this article yesterday, and I just want to read you a few thoughts from what this writer was sharing, or is sharing with us. And her name is Arwa Damon. I think she's Arab, she says here in her article. And this was written on October 24th, 2023, so fairly recent, right? And the title of the article, she says, "I spent 2 decades as a CNN correspondent. We journalists need to do a better job reporting the truth." Right? So she's obviously suggesting that journalists are not doing a great job in reporting the truth. And let me just say something here before we get into the article. You must understand that we're human beings, and we are flawed beings, right? Even if I have good intentions, let us say that I see something happening on the road, for example, an accident. You probably will hear from, I'll give my version of what I saw, right? Of what I heard, of what I smelled, etc., etc., etc. Right? Somebody might come and give you a different story. And not because sometimes that person might have bad intentions, but this is who we are. We respond to things differently, right? And we have different belief systems. And what might be offensive to somebody else might not be offensive to another person. So they report the story in 2 distinct ways. Not because they have bad intentions. Sometimes they might, but sometimes they don't. Right? But let's say they don't have any bad intentions. The fact is that you are going to hear. You might hear some basic truths or consistency in the story. And that is what you need to look at, the consistency. As you hear, let's say you hear from 10 persons about one accident, a particular accident that happened on the roads, right? Then you have to look at the consistency in all those 10 people. And then you will decide if what they have said is true. And more than likely, if 10 people are saying the same thing, then you can say that there is some truth to what they're saying. But if their stories are divergent, some are saying this, some said that it was blue, others said it was pink, another person it was yellow, then you have to question. And you might put a question mark there because that is what we call healthy skepticism. And many of us do not have that. What we think we do, we have these philosophies to which we are tethered, right? And then you listen to CNN and CNN tells you what you want to hear. Or you listen to MSNBC and MSNBC tells you what you want to hear. And Fox and the BBCs and the Guardians and the Jamaica Gleaner and the Observer, right? And you think that these things are true. But how is it true? And they have different, sometimes, for the most part, they have different stories. Their narratives differ. Then you have to question, and you've got to do your own research. You've got to do your own research. It is very, very interesting how human beings, for the life of me, sometimes will not even trust their own family members. Or some of people don't even trust their own spouses. But they sit at a television set and trust everything that somebody who is using a teleprompter is telling you. It amazes me. I don't understand it. But I understand, I should say, that mind control is a reality. And the media often uses mind control. And let me just say that when I say mind control, the warfare that we are about to face is not going to be one of physical combat. It's going to be a mental warfare where you have to decide based on loads of information, what is true and what is false, right? And this is what is very difficult to do because you've got to show moral courage, even if 99% of the population is saying that it's true, but you know that it's a lie. Will you stand? Will you stand alone or with a few people and say that this is not true? Do you have that moral courage to do that? Many of us, sadly, do not have that moral courage, right? Do you know that, let me not preach a sermon. We have to get into the article because, there's so many things happening and I have a lot of intellectual juices and I cannot afford for my videos to be too long and boring, right? So let's get into the weeds of the discussion. Now, she opens up her article and with a oft-quoted sentence that she suggests here, but as she asserts, the first casualty of war is the truth. Every time you have a war, you need to lie because we all know by now, I hope you know, well, I shouldn't say we all know, because there are some people who think that wars are real. Well, they're real in the sense that people are fighting, you see people fighting, but they are not natural in terms of, they're not what we have been told many times that they are, right? So because they're not true, because war is a racket, then lies have to be concocted. Lies have to be manufactured so that whomever is fighting, the authorities, those responsible for the war, can be hidden, right? You will not see them, right? You see the contrived enemy. They will have to contrive enemies so that you'll believe. And oftentimes, whom you see as the enemy is not really the enemy. I'm not saying that person might be your friend too, but that is not the real threat, right? And let me give you a strategy when you're listening to the mainstream media in terms of determining what is truth. You know, if they say that something is ugly or something is beautiful or pretty, always think the opposite. Because I think most times, I'm not saying all the time, but I think most times you will be correct. If you just say, if they think that person is ugly, I think that person is pretty. Even if you think that person is ugly, it's better to think that person is pretty or handsome, right? And if they say the opposite, the same is true. And I think you should be able to get the gist, even if you don't have all the facts with you. Because right now, once you see a liar, you know what a liar is, and you cannot trust him or her because the confidentiality, right? When trust goes out of the door or goes through the door, right? There's no relationship. The relationship is lost, right? Now, here's what she's saying. As a 20-year veteran of the journalism industry, 2 decades spent mainly covering war and violence, right? So this is she probably is my age. I would think she's in her 40s, right? And she said that she has spent 2 decades mainly covering war and violence. How traumatic that is for a correspondent, a journalist, to be covering war and violence. I can attest to that and how each side is trying to lure and manipulate, very good word here, with their messaging, what some might even call propaganda. I can attest to how each side will lie or try to cover up the truth, even when a side claims to have a higher moral standing. I can also attest to just how hard it is to navigate through the many pieces of information hurling themselves in your direction, coming from sources on the ground, eyewitnesses, officials, and social media, which is a beast of its own with its trolls and state-sponsored cyber armies. Add to the journalist's emotional reaction to the images the world sees and the words heard from survivors. As the media, we need to realize the role we play in the trajectory of events. Our role can either inflame or educate and explain by building bridges of empathy and understanding. And that is the role of journalism, which we're not seeing right now because people are taking sides and they are inflaming, right, different passions. And that's why people are going to war. Looking at the coverage of what is happening between Israel and the Gaza Strip since the October 7 attack by the militant group Hamas, it feels like we're catapulting ourselves toward this abyss of sheer and utter inhumane madness. The events take me back to the drums of the Iraq War after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, a runaway train where many Western, especially American media, shared this effort and the US narrative of good versus evil. Oversimplification is so dangerous. And that is the whole point. We can't say this is white and this is black. And Americans care about the white people and the white Jews and care less about the brown Palestinians. That is what we call oversimplification. It is much more nuanced than that, right? And many people just like to be in their own narrow world, making these simplistic statements, not realizing that the issues are far much complicated and complex than we possibly can imagine. In fact, a lot of what we should know, we don't even have access to, right? We lack a lot of information. We can only respond to what they tell us, right? But we do know, based on history, even recent history, I don't have to talk about that recent history, that the media houses, right, that the mainstream media are not about disseminating truth from both sides of the aisle, that is. I was in New York City on September 11 and not yet a journalist. So she was a young person in her 20s like I was. My body trembled in fear and confusion as I witnessed the Second World Trade Tower come down. I remember how the streets were so eerily deserted at first. The only people were those looking to donate blood or somehow help. At the time, I thought, this is how we should treat each other. This is the sort of kindness I want to be a part of. But then it all changed. So she's now transitioning. She's now telling us that the people are now transitioning from, demonstrating sympathy and empathy to probably being emotionally charged. I remember the hatred and vitriol spewed towards Muslims and people of Middle Eastern and North African descent. It was something that I was spared being a direct target of, despite being an Arab American of Syrian heritage, simply because I am blonde with green eyes. I also remember watching how, because she's an Arab, but she's blonde with green eyes, right? So she's not the typical brown as we think all Arabs are. I also remember watching how somehow all Arabs and Muslims got painted out with this terrorist brush, watching coverage that lacked nuance and understanding. It was what pushed me to become a journalist, right? So she's telling us of how one-sided that reporting after 9/11 was. Despite being so deeply reminded of the past, this present that we are living in is very different and arguably even more dangerous, right? Military commanders and even President Joe Biden are warning of the lessons of the past, of the point in time when victory will be declared and how there needs to be a plan for peace. And they're telling us that they're going to be ending wars and terrorism, which is not possible, right? That is not possible. To end terrorism is delusional. In this world, that is delusional. We can see that we want to reduce it. We want to minimize terrorism by being kinder to our neighbors, right? And living in a more just world. We want to create a more just world. Yes, we can work towards that. But to suggest that we're going to end terrorism, I don't think. And, who is the terrorist? We should ask. That is the question. I fear that in that planning, based on everything I am seeing and hearing now from heads of state to people on the street, the intense impact of the emotions generated now is not being planned for at all. Or even more disturbing, it is being planned for a complete and total meltdown of humanity, which we will all be complicit in bringing around. Yeah. For it is not quite the same as the post 9/11 era. The juncture we are in is potentially more divisive, dangerous, and destructive. And I understand that we cannot use this word, as often as we do. Dangerous. Yeah? We're living in dangerous times. Okay. There is a much deeper, darker history here with a deeply embedded generational trauma, all of which makes the emotional component of this even more intense. Make no mistake, emotions play such a big part in warfare. There is a reason why there is an information war. So this is the war we're facing, people. Information war. It is not the physical combat, but you and I are facing. We are constantly being bombarded with informational war. And we've got to make a decision, right? And the decision has to be individual. It's become a significant component of military strategy. Let me read it again. It's because, rather, a significant component of military strategy is not just troop movement on the ground, nor striking strategic targets, but psychological operations. These psychological operations, aka mind control, target not just the population against whom war is being waged, but all of us. All right, so what you listen to on CNN or the TVJ, that's Television Jamaica, right? And shout out to my uncle who thinks that, oh, yeah, he has to listen to the news because that's what he's accustomed to doing. Yeah, you know, our mental state is synonymous to our physical state, or I should say our mental well-being, better said, right, is synonymous with our physical well-being. So in the same way, we have to eat healthy food to sustain us physically so that we can live in the physical realm, right? You can walk, you can talk, you can breathe, right? It is the same way in which we have to feed our minds with healthy mental, intellectual food. So if you're feeding your mind with toxic lies, then it's going to have an impact on your mental development, on your cognitive development, and you will not be able to think clearly. And if you can't think clearly, then you won't be able to make intelligent decisions. Right? So if you can stop while you're in your 70s, as my uncle is right now, right? If you can stop eating unhealthy foods because you fear the damage that it can do to your bodies, then you also have to learn to stop eating and digesting toxic mental food. Okay? Because we are what we feed our minds upon. We're what we think. And what we think come from what we put in, what we input into the cognitive domain called the brain. Now, so she goes, she said, no nation, because I'm not going to read the entire article, no nation can gather support for war within its borders or from its global allies without painting its enemy as less than. Right? So we are sanctimonious, and the othering of the other, right? The other is evil. A life worth less than yours, a life that is not human in the way that you are, a life that doesn't love like you, laugh like you, or hurt like you. This is how we end up, consciously or not, accepting the significant loss of civilian life. Yesterday I was also reading an article in which an American, I think also now has graduated from college. And in the article, he was saying that when he was in college, he met a lot of Iranians. Iranians had come were attending rather his college. And, his views were that they were very wonderful, humorous, pleasant, warm people. But the media paints these people as people who want to kill, as terrorists. And we're not suggesting here, or I am certainly not suggesting here, that all Iranians, or all Americans, or all British, right, or all Trinidadians are sanctimonious people or saints. What we're saying is that you cannot paint an entire nation of people as the media would like to classify people. All brown people, all Middle Easterners are this way, right? And, from time to time, we're all guilty of doing that, I must confess. But when we're talking about wars, we have to be very careful how we think about that, because it can result in the deaths of or injury, right, of hundreds of thousands of people, as we're seeing in the media. One of the things I must say, and somebody who has studied language and culture extensively, right, I think we need to go back to the study of the humanities. I think we are putting too much emphasis on the study of science, while that too is important, but right now we're humans first, and then we can talk about the scientific and the nature in in which we live, nature, the environment in which we live. Both are important, and perhaps we should put equal attention, because I think we have lost our humanity, or we are losing very rapidly our humanity. And to understand our humanity, we must understand people who are different from us, who speak a different language, who exist in a different culture. We must understand these important nuances, which many people do not. And it's very difficult sometimes to communicate with people who are just immersed in their own language and culture. They don't understand the other, that there's a different way of thinking. And not because there's a different way of thinking does it mean, therefore, that they are less human to you. They just don't think similarly. They don't eat similarly. They don't dress similarly. They don't go to the same synagogues or the same church similar as you do. And this is something very difficult for us to understand and to appreciate and to learn to tolerate, because some of the things that they eat, or the religions that they practice, or how they dress might not be comfortable, because that's not how we were socialized. But we have to learn to tolerate other people, because we're not living in a righteous world. We're not living in a perfect world. And in many cases, if the truth be told, differences are attractive if we learn to appreciate the differences in people. And I'm not talking now, people being evil and, and being immoral, because that's another. And even if they are, we must not think that we are gods, that we should obliterate them from the face of the earth, right? Because that's not our responsibility either. Here's what he says about the Western media. The Western media needs to give more space to Palestinians. And we all need to really listen and treat their words as if we are hearing them for the first time. There is this very strong normalization of the plight of the Palestinians, perhaps because it has been going on for so long, for more than 7 decades. And the media spotlight, being as limited as it is, kept moving on. Palestinians are right when they question why the outcry and the coverage of their pain is muted. To those networks who do think they're covering both sides because they have the one package out of the Gaza Strip and one guest, it's not enough when the rest of your coverage is leaning so heavily into military operations, or even worse, consists of a lineup of mostly older white men who have not tasted, smelt, nor felt what war feels like on the other end of an American or an Israeli bomb. They are experts who have not lived or experienced, in this scenario, the Arab side of it. And that is so true, right? Let me not go into because I can digress quite easily. Lots of things are in my head, so I have to control my thoughts, right? Okay, The media needs to realize and recognize the role we can play in fueling polarization and hate, whether that be through simply negating or disregarding a person or a population's pain. We did play a role in fomenting the deep hatred post 9/11 that ultimately led to a more violent world. So the media has a part to play and is also culpable of inducing this violent, some of the aspects that we're seeing now of, creating this violent world. We need to be hyper conscious not to play that role again, right? Which they are playing, it's so sorry to say that. He says here, I can see the trajectory we're on, the spiral of animosity and the growing monster that fuels a madness we will not be able to control. I can see a world filled with more hate and violence that will impact not just our generation, but generations to come. And I can see the media's role in preventing that. There are many aspects of this that we cannot alter, but we can ensure that we are not pushing divisions. We need to be stronger and better than the pressures on us, be it pressure from our government, our bosses, and even, I like this, and even our own emotions, because sometimes our emotions get the better of us, right? Because we are not well informed. All of us are guilty of that. We must build a world with more power in the truth than in the lie. Right? And I want to hear you too. You notice that she has not talked about facts. She's talking about the truth. Right? The founding father did not open up the Declaration of Independence, that's the US founding fathers, by saying that we, know these self-evident facts. They're truths. Right? We can compile, we can amass the facts to show that these facts add up to the truth. But sometimes so many times I'm talking to people and they're telling me, oh, the facts, these are the facts, because these are the facts that support your side of the story. Right? And the people who are in the US and in the world and, who are on the side of the Palestinians, or on the side of the Israelis, that's a cult. Because all of us should be on the side of truth and on the side of humanity. Humanity. Right? That is what we need to understand. Because we also have a lot of Jews who are against what is happening and what their government is doing. We have a lot of Palestinians who are against what the Hamas people have done. And we do not know all the facts. We hear that Mossad, which is the Israeli intelligence organization, seemed to have, this is just a theory, might have invested in the Hamas terrorist group because their agenda was to work with the United States to, to begin to invade countries like Iran and other neighboring countries in that section of the world. Right? We don't know if these things are true. Right? So it's for us not to just deny these things, not to brush them aside, but to look at how the stories are adding up, how the narratives are coming together, and for you to decide. And I would add, if you're religious like I am, to ask God, is this true? Or is it a lie? Now, to end this, I know that tomorrow in the United States, lots of people will be celebrating Thanksgiving, right? But, this is a very strong message that God had given Isaiah to declare to the Jews, because the Jews were humans like us, right? So we talk about the Jews were, as a nation, they have lost that privilege of being God's chosen people. But remember, they lost that privilege because they were just being humans like we are. Human frailties, right? Whenever God blesses us, we begin to use those blessings to inflict harm upon people. We become proud, right? And haughty. And then we want to show people that we are superior to them. And the Jews, unfortunately, because God had blessed them so much, and the nations had seen how much God had blessed them, they involved themselves. They were involved in the most despicable acts that you can ever think about: killing, pedophilia, sacrificing their children to idols, literally sacrificing their children to idols, doing all the evils that God had told them not to engage themselves in. But because they thought their blessings, they were prosperous, they were like, God is blessing us, despite the fact that we're doing evil in the world, despite the fact we're oppressing our own people, and we are also oppressing foreigners. God is still blessing us because, after all, they fooled themselves that we are still God's chosen people. And no matter what we do, God is still going to bless us. That's what they thought, until their temple was left unto them desolate. I say this to you because I want to read a few verses from Isaiah 58. And this is to Americans primarily, but to all of us who think that because God is blessing us, we think that we can do whatever we want to do. But God is here speaking through the prophet to all of us. And as Americans, as you go to eat your turkey tomorrow and to celebrate Thanksgiving, remember the words of Isaiah 58. It says here, "Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and shew my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching to God. Wherefore have we fasted, say they, and thou seest not? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast ye find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Behold, ye fast for strife and debate, and to smite with a fist of wickedness. Ye shall not fast as ye do this day, to make your voice to be heard on high. Is it such a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush, and to spread sackcloth and ashes on him? Wilt thou call this a fast, and an acceptable day to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that he break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. So God is not impressed with your celebrating a Thanksgiving tomorrow, right? With your leaders, with the American leaders, actually, right? Supporting the gruesome atrocities that we're seeing happening in Gaza. God is very displeased, right? And he is asking us to have a fast where we break up our fallow grounds, where we begin not to endorse the evils in which our leaders are engaged, right? We've got to be to stand up and to cry out and to let them know that what is happening in Gaza is unacceptable from a humanitarian perspective. And we are not concerned that Washington is going to send humanitarian aid into a war zone, because we know that that's a lie. The greatest humanitarian effort that Washington and the Biden administration can do is to stop the war, right? And to negotiate a ceasefire immediately so that lives can be preserved. Thank you so much for joining. It was a great discussion. I enjoyed myself talking about the issues. Of course, it's not an enjoyable topic, but you know, I have to present it with some amount of enthusiasm, right? So that you can be engaged. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in another chat. All the best. Bye.